Today on this episode of The Brain Surgeon's Take, we will be discussing overcoming blindness with Neuralink consultant and UCSF faculty member Dr. Dan Adams. Learn how nanotechnology is pushing the frontiers of brain-machine interfaces and potentially restoring sight to those previously blind. Much more on this podcast episode. Welcome back, everyone. Here's my take on Dan Adams. He's a leader in neuroscience who is pushing forward the frontiers of what is possible in the world of brain-machine interfaces. Dan's background is perfect as a nationally renowned ophthalmologist at UCSF, where he understands how we can repair a damaged visual system. Together with a game-changing company like Neuralink, Dan's visionary ideas have been empowered to finally overcome medical boundaries previously thought impossible. I want to give a little bit of credit to Neuralink for providing the massive financial support necessary to make these scientific advancements possible. Without the backing of Neuralink, Dan's ideas are merely that, ideas. So thanks to Neuralink for working with geniuses like Dan to make science fiction a reality. As a neurosurgeon, I truly enjoyed doing this interview, as I can say it's never been more exciting to see the progress being made daily in the field of neuroscience. The brain and spine are the last frontier in medicine, and it's people like Dan that are rapidly conquering that frontier and making modern miracles happen. The future is now. Our knowledge of the brain and spine is accelerating at an exponential pace, leading us to wonder, is anything truly impossible? Will the blind see? Will the mute be able to speak? Will the paralyzed be able to move? Listen up as we discuss Neuralink, overcoming blindness. Check it out. Hey, Dan, how you doing?
I'm doing well, thanks. How are you?
Good. Listen, super excited to talk to you today. Very interesting work you're doing with Neuralink, and really excited to hear all about it. We'll just get right into the questions.
Great.
So, your story is interesting. I wanted to go into, how did you first get involved in neuroplasticity, neuroregeneration, neuroprosthetics?
Well, I first got interested in the visual system in general. So I sort of spent about 23 years doing academic research in binocular vision. That was my main interest at UCSF. And then when Neuralink came along, I saw it as a way to actually apply what I'd learned about the visual system in a way that actually stood a very good chance of helping, hopefully, a great many people. So as I say, my primary interest wasn't originally in neuroplasticity or in neuroprosthetics, but just in having a better understanding of the visual system in general.
Give us a little background. How complex is the human visual pathway?
That's a hard question. I mean, the brain obviously is very complex by nature. All parts of it are very complex. The visual system is equally complex in the way that it works as the rest of the brain, but we probably have a better understanding of it than most other parts of the brain. And this is really because it's been historically a very well-studied area, and is actually quite easy to study experimentally. So you can show an animal or a person images and record activity that appears in the brain, either with electrodes or with fMRI or some other techniques. So it's an accessible part of the visual system. And certainly in primates, it's a large part of the brain. I've heard people say that if you flash a light in someone's eye, you'll get a response to that light in a third of the brain. In some kind of way, cells will respond to it because we're such predominantly visual animals. So it's complex, but it's well understood. And I would say that there's still plenty of things that we don't understand about it, but we have a pretty good idea about how visual space is mapped into the cortex in sort of multiple visual areas that each contain a map of the visual field. And the theory is that each of these areas has a sort of a different role in processing of visual information. So it's a sort of distributed network of interconnected areas that each has a specific and functionalized role in analyzing some part of the visual image.
People talk about the human brain being similar to a supercomputer. Is there any computer in the world that is nearly as complex and powerful as the human brain?
I am not an expert on computers. I wouldn't really necessarily know that. I doubt it. And certainly just in terms of number of synapses. So I guess you could equate in some kind of way a synapse to a single transistor on a chip. And I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but I think there are orders of magnitude more synapses in the brain than there are, you know, individual transistors on a chip. I don't think it's impossible that one day we'll have chips that are at least on a spatial or anatomical scale similar to the human brain. But of course, it's more than just a numbers game, um, uh, and maybe you don't need that many synapses to have a system that can work as well, if not better, than a human brain. So it's kind of a false equivalency to equate number of synapses with number of transistors or those sorts of things. I think it's more about the actual functioning of the brain than just a sort of numbers brain. Obviously, if we wanted to reproduce the brain, we wouldn't do it in a biological way. So maybe there's a better way to do it than the brain has evolved itself.
Now, what about, it's obviously the last frontier of medicine. It's the organ that we understand the least about. What do you think is the main factor that limits our understanding of the brain?
I think we actually have on a sort of mechanistic level, we have a pretty good understanding of the brain. We know how transmission of information occurs from one neuron to another. We know about how receptors bind with neurotransmitters, and we understand how electrical signals are passed along axons. We also have a pretty good understanding about the systems in the brain: the visual system, auditory system, somatosensory and motor systems, how they're organized on a more sort of macro scale. The things that are considered the final frontiers are the things that, to me, are just really difficult to understand in any case. So, for example, how does consciousness come about? How do we have perception? How do we have free will? These are the questions which, to me, are the most difficult to answer, because we can't even imagine answers to them. So if you're faced with a problem and you can say, well, it's, something's wrong with your car. It could be the alternator, it could be the battery, it could be something else. At least you have ideas about what the answers to your questions are. When you say, well, how does consciousness arise in the brain? We can't even think of a possible answer to that. So although we probably have a better, the field of science probably has a better understanding of how the brain works than the layperson realizes, but we still don't have the answers to the big questions. And these are the questions that are on most people's minds. When you talk to someone in the street, what do you want to know about the brain? They say, well, how can I see the color red? And how can I recognize my mother? And these are the questions that we're just beginning to scratch the surface on. But I think it's possible that these are the questions that we may not be capable of understanding. Certainly questions like consciousness and perception, they may not have answers that we can actually wrap our own minds around.
Which is what I would agree. I think the irony there is that I think the limiting factor to us understanding those questions is our brain itself. I don't
Absolutely.
think our brain is complex enough to understand itself. I think that's kind of the irony, right? It's like the brain is trying to rationalize and understand how itself works. And I
Yeah.
think to some extent, the main limiting factor to us understanding the brain is our own brain. We just can't, like you said, we can't grasp our minds around these abstract concepts. And I think that that's just a limitation of our brain itself. So it's kind of ironic that the main limiting factor is the brain itself. This episode of The Brain Surgeon's Take is brought to you by vitamin water. Vitamin water is the ideal way to hydrate, replete your electrolytes, and maintain wellness. I drink vitamin water routinely during the day in order to keep up my energy and focus. Check out vitaminwater.com for more information and use the promo code BrainSurgeonsTake for 20% off your first order. And that brings us to the next point of the podcast, which is kind of Neuralink, the work you're doing, which is incredibly fascinating. Tell us a little bit about Neuralink and what is the mission of the company, the overall mission?
So the overall mission is to produce basically a general purpose neural implant. And this is something that will have a number of different applications. The first application that we're focused on is restoring, or rather allowing people with paralysis to interact with a computer by controlling a cursor and a screen, like basically having the equivalent of a Bluetooth mouse in their head. So they'll be able to sit down in front of a computer screen, and although they may be paralyzed from the neck down from spinal cord injury, excuse me, or from ALS, they'll actually be able to connect the implant to the computer as if it were a Bluetooth mouse, and then control the cursor just
Wow.
by thinking about how they want to move it around the screen. So that's the first sort of low-hanging fruit application that we're going for. Once we have a device that we can safely and easily implant into a great many people, we can begin to look at other applications. And of course, the application that I'm most interested in is that of a visual prosthetic, to be able to basically take information from a video camera and bypass the eye that would be damaged by disease or injury and feed that information directly into the visual cortex. Beyond that, there are other applications too. One of the things that we're looking at also is a way to control a prosthetic limb using an implant that's placed in motor cortex and somatosensory cortex. So in this case, someone will be able to think about moving their arm, and although their arm is missing, that same signal will be used to control a motorized prosthetic arm. And not only that, we'll be able to use electronic sensors on the hand to actually feed somatosensory touch information back into the somatosensory part of the brain. So not only they will be able to move the hand, they'll also be able to feel sensation from it.
Super interesting. And I think everyone has heard of the company Neuralink by now, and they may not know all the details, but they know that it's a massive company with, tremendous resources. Tell us, and you're one of the lead neuroscientists for them. Tell us what it's like to work at Neuralink with all those resources and brain power. Is it just an incredible source of support for your work and ideas?
It's truly an inspiring environment. That there are a huge number of things that we do at Neuralink. We try to keep everything in-house. So we produce our own electrodes, we do our own electronics, we design our own ASIC chips, the little amplifier chips that inside the device itself. And so that means that we have a huge variety of expertise in the company. It's amazing to sit down at lunch with these people and have conversations that range from thin layer production of electrodes through to electronics to software engineering to biology as well. We have histologists, we have just a huge range of truly expert people in the company. And to me, that's very exciting. I spent most of my scientific career working in a small lab, focusing on very approachable problems. And here, suddenly, the scope of what we do is so huge that it's really exciting. Um, yeah, I came here really because the part of the scientific research that I enjoyed most was the kind of the craft, the practical side of it. I love building things and tinkering with things and making things work. And so it's, for me at least, it's incredibly exciting to be among a group of engineers who share that passion and to be able to really make some pretty incredible devices.
Just from the outside, it looks like an incredible compilation of brain power that's put into one company, and everyone benefits from that, obviously, right? The brainstorming, the ideas, the hypotheses that come from people that are all incredibly well educated, geniuses, borderline at least, and all working towards the same cutting edge technology. I think it's super interesting. You had mentioned before about how the goal is to have a chip that helps the brain work in a Bluetooth fashion. And in reading about it, it's the N1 Neuralink brain chip. Tell us a little bit about how this chip is supposed to work, like
So
how it
it's
goes in, how it
yeah
connects, how does it interact with the brain?
yeah. So it's a small device. It's about the size of a quarter, and I think one of the most important things about it is that it's completely subcutaneous. So once it's been installed, it's basically invisible, and this is why it needs Bluetooth, because obviously previous devices have always had to have a connector and cables to transmit signals out of the skull, whereas ours is completely wireless. That's one of the great benefits that we get from it, because it eliminates the problems with infection and with basically chronic wound care that you have with a percutaneous connector. It is installed, most of its volume is actually installed inside a skull cavity. So the way that we install it is to cut a circular hole in the skull, and then all the thread-like electrodes are inserted into the brain, and then the device itself acts as a plug for that hole. So although it has a pretty small volume anyway, most of that volume is actually taken up inside the thickness of the skull, which makes it very low profile. One of the advantages that we have over other mechanisms, other electrodes, is that our electrodes are incredibly thin and flexible. So they have to be inserted with a very fine needle under the control of a robot. But once they're in place, they move with the brain. The brain is, I'm sure you understand, you know this very well, the brain is very soft. And when people move their heads around, it wobbles inside the brain. And if you insert a stiff electrode into that, then you can get some relative motion between the electrode and the brain surface, and between the brain. And that's obviously not good. Whereas our electrodes, because they're so fine, they move around with the brain, and that means that they have a much longer lifespan than stiff electrodes, and they can also be inserted without causing bleeding, without causing damage in the brain. One of the things that we're really focused on at Neuralink is to make the insertion of these electrodes as minimally invasive as possible. So our robot, for example, has a very high resolution image of the brain surface, and we're able to see all those tiny vessels, little venules and arterioles that spread across the surface of the cortex. And when we insert the electrodes, we can basically put the electrodes between those vessels and avoid causing bleeds. Whereas this is something that the other approaches haven't been able to do. So one of the advantages, one of the things that I think is necessary if we are to produce a device that is going to be installed into thousands and thousands of people, is that it should cause the least amount of damage possible. So that's something that we're very focused on doing.
Yeah, that's a whole separate topic, because if hundreds of thousands of people are getting brain surgery, you're really going to keep me and my colleagues pretty busy over here. So,
well, we like to joke actually that we're going to put you out of business, because one of the ways to do this in very large volume is to have fewer neurosurgeons. The neurosurgeon is one of the most expensive parts of the entire surgery. So if we can have the robot do much of the surgery, then we'll be able to make this into a much more affordable and a much faster surgical intervention. Yeah.
Well, I'm a fan, except for putting neurosurgeons out of business. But anyway,
I don't think we will completely. Yeah.
But I wanted to get into, just in terms of layman's kind of terms, you were talking about giving the blind sight again and having the ability to take visual information, bypassing the damaged eye or the damaged optic nerve, and then delivering that information to the visual cortex. How are you repackaging camera data into a brain compatible format? Like, what is a brain compatible format? How do you make that transition?
So when you put an electrode into the visual cortex and inject a tiny amount of current, just a few tens of microamps of alternating current, little pulses, you generate basically a spot of vision in that person's perception. And that's the properties of that spot. It's called a phosphene. The properties of that spot depend really on a number of things, but one of them is just what kinds of cells were you stimulating. So the way the visual system is organized is that cells are specialized to signal a particular type of information. So for example, a group of cells might become active when the person sees something that's blue, or another group of cells might become active when they see something moving from the left to the right. And so when you stimulate those cells, the person will perceive what those cells signal. It's like a sort of labeled line system. So that means when you put hundreds, or in our case, hopefully thousands of electrodes into the visual cortex, each of those electrodes will cause the perception of a phosphene with particular properties. If each phosphene you produce is just a little white spot, then you'll be able to control the intensity or the whether each of those spots is off or on, in a way to reproduce a visual scene, rather like a sort of dot matrix printer, for example. So I think one of the things that we really want to be careful about is not to increase expectations in blind people by saying that we're going to restore vision. What we're really doing is using the visual cortex as a sensory surface to inject useful visually perceptive information into. People have done this, for example, with sensors on people's backs or their tongue or ways like that. But what we're really doing is exploiting visual perception as a sensory surface to provide information about the world. The image that everyone who's sighted has in front of their face with color, movement, depth, that image, to try and reproduce that image by stimulation of the brain is something that we, at the moment at least, can only aspire to. The best we can do is basically reproduce that as a probably monochrome pattern of individual dots across the visual field. So I'm very careful about saying things like visual restoration or regaining a visual picture of the world, but rather allowing someone to maneuver themselves around the world, like avoid bumping into lampposts or recognize people, and those sorts of things, just using their visual perception from a limited number of points, rather than reproducing, curing the blind. But having said that, there are a number of things that we can also do outside of the brain that can give that information extra dimensions, literally. So, for example, you could have a stereo camera that produces depth, and then have a way to signal to the person, maybe using a particular phosphene that they are aware of or know about, to signal, oh, there's an approaching car, or there's a tree there, or something. So you can actually produce individual information using those phosphenes. One thing that, for example, we could do would be to have the camera and a processor like an iPhone, for example, outside the person do facial recognition. So then whenever someone whose face the camera recognizes comes into the room, say, a partner or a mother, a particular phosphene in the person's visual field will light up and say, oh, your mother's in the room. And so the person who's aware of someone coming into the room can recognize this, the system recognizes their face and just tells them who that person is. And I kind of think of this in a sense of like the same way that a Tesla car works, by basically visually recognizing things and simplifying them and giving that information directly to the person.
Now, I want to get into some of the really deep questions, not just technical, but, obviously, if you're connecting computer hardware directly to our brain, that comes with an enormous technical, regulatory, ethical challenges. What are your thoughts on this slippery slope?
I think there's, the field of medicine progresses, and there are a great many devices that we use as healthcare devices to improve the quality of people's lives. I don't see that there's anything particularly special about a device that interacts with our brains to help people to regain functions that they've lost through disease or injury. I don't see it as a slippery slope in any more sense than just the progress of medical technology is. You can call it a slippery slope, but it could also be a slope in the other direction. It's actually increasing people's quality of life. So certainly, with respect to the things that we're able to do at the moment with a neural implant, I don't think there's anything sinister or particularly ethically disturbing about helping people by having a device that can interact with their brain, any worse than helping people having a device to interact with their spinal cord, for example, or any other part of their system. Obviously,
I would say I agree in that if there's a deficit, if someone's blind or they're paralyzed, using technology to help them regain that function, I'm all for.
Mm.
I guess the major ethical question is implanting that N1 chip into people that are normal human beings to augment their interaction with their environment and having that Bluetooth technology. Many people have said that Neuralink is opening up Pandora's box and playing God. I'm not saying that I agree with that or disagree. I just kind of wanted to get your opinion on, do you feel like, again, apart from people that have a deficit, normal human beings who do not have a deficit, who potentially want this chip to interact with their environment in a different way, do you think that is playing God?
Um, I wouldn't say it was. I wouldn't say it was playing God. Um, I think that you know humans in general are going to be around on this planet for a very long time, and I think that fields like this are almost inevitable. Um, Not maybe in my lifetime, maybe not even in my children's lifetime, but we hopefully will have a few more tens of thousands of years on this planet. Um, I don't think we certainly at this stage should start giving ourselves rules that we can't improve our lives in a certain way. Um, so I think you know I think humanity has kind of lost sight of big projects to a certain extent. Uh, you know, it wasn't so long ago that we were doing things like building pyramids that took hundreds of years, generations to do. Um, these days, I think we've become short-sighted. We don't begin projects and have big ideas about things that can't be finished within a single generation. So it could be generations before the kinds of augmentations that we're thinking about could be put in place for normal people. But I don't think that should stop us from going down that road. Um,
Okay. Let me stick with the tough questions because that's why we're here. Uh,
yeah.
If we implant chips into humans and we can interact in a Bluetooth fashion with our environment, are we any different than a robot?
Well, that kind of depends on the robot. It, it, it sort of depends. Are we indifferent from a robot? Yeah, of course, we're biological systems. We're not robots. We never will be. It's possible that robots may one day be able to behave like us and have intelligence like us and interactions as we do. Um, but humans will always be humans. We're not. We can't take that away from ourselves. No matter what devices that we invent to help us or increase our quality of life.
Now, you're on the cutting edge of neuroscience. Obviously, you're one of the lead neuroscience consultants for one of the lead nanotechnology neuroscience companies. Give us your crystal ball view, some major breakthroughs you see happening in the next 5 or 10 years. You had mentioned, you know, in your kid's lifetime and all that. Let's focus on the relative future. What do you see happening in the next 5 or 10 years that's going to be tangible?
Um, Thank you for the compliments, but I think I see myself as less of a scientist, but more of a technologist now. Um, and I think one thing to remember is that at Neuralink, we're not really doing science. We've been criticized by scientists who've come along and said, "Oh, this is great, but there were people doing this 10 years, 20 years ago." And to a great extent, that's true. We are developing a product that can be used to help thousands of people that is based on scientific research. We're not really doing that scientific research ourselves. In terms of scientific research in general, with a crystal ball, I think science moves uh, quite slowly, and our understanding of the brain moves slowly. There are occasional big leaps in our understanding that usually come around from an actually an advancement in technological systems like methodological systems. For example, the invention of fMRI, for example, has caused a revolution in neuroscience. Hopefully, our device will also cause a revolution in understanding of the brain. as well as being able to help people, will also be able to use information recorded from their brain to better understand processing that's going on in normal functional normal function of people's brains. Much of the advances in neuroscience are actually coming from the advances at the moment, coming from advances in genomics and molecular biology in the brain. Hopefully, we'll continue to find and understand the causes of diseases, for example, Alzheimer's and Parkinson's disease, and find ways to treat those diseases. I think the progress of science, is slow, but it's steady, and I wouldn't say that there's any huge revelation that I can cast light on coming up. Hopefully, we'll just continue to plug away and do good science and understand things well enough that we can actually help people with diseases.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny that you say that science moves slowly, because we are moving super fast. If you look at the trajectory of advancement in the last 10 years versus 50 years ago, it's just we're moving at such a rapid pace. And I think that's great. Like you said, I think there's going to be major breakthroughs coming through. Final question, because I know you're really busy. You've been so accomplished. You've done so much in your career. What are your next goals? What's your ultimate aspiration?
I'm very excited about the progress that we can make with Neuralink. I think that the approach that we're taking is really the only way. Excuse me. It's really the only way that a device can help a great many people. So far, much of the sort of neural implant field has worked in academic labs with small numbers of participants, and what we're doing is making a device that can help a great many people. I think the aim of Neuralink is to help a great many people in a very profound way. And up until now, most neuroprosthetic devices have helped a small number of people in a profound way. So I'm very excited about moving forward with Neuralink, applying the Neuralink technology to other diseases, to other deficits in neurology, and just seeing how many people can we help, and how accepted and standardized the Neuralink can become as a way of helping people with neurological disease.
Listen, Dan, what a fascinating interview. I think the take-home points for me are that what was once perceived as science fiction is becoming reality, and I think that's what's both amazing and scary at the same time. I know that you're immersed in this environment. This is what you do every single day of your life. This is your job. But for someone from the outside, even for someone like myself who operates on the brain, the stuff you guys are doing is unbelievable. In reading about your projects and your technology and what your goals are, it truly is bringing science fiction into reality. I mean, where does it end? I mean, giving back sight, giving back movement, I mean, if you had told someone 20 years ago that there was going to be a way, or a thought, that the brain would communicate via Bluetooth with the environment, that's ludicrous. And it's actually becoming real. So kudos to you, all of your colleagues. Neuralink, what a tremendous resource. It's exciting to think about, as a neurosurgeon, what's my job going to look like in 10, 15 years? What are we going to be doing for these patients that have strokes or spinal cord injury? So again, kudos. Thanks for all your hard work. And what a tremendous opportunity for you and your colleagues.
Thanks very much. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you. Thanks for having me.
Awesome, Dan.